Honestly, some people just have no situational awareness. You'd think on a flight packed with military personnel heading to Norfolk, she'd put the arts and crafts away. What's she going to do if something happens? Knit the enemy a surrender flag. The voice, a low baritone accustomed to command and saturated with an almost theatrical arrogance, cut through the monotonous drone of the Boeing 737's engines. The flight attendant, a young woman with a practiced but fraying smile, offered a noncommittal nod. The man in the seat across the aisle, a junior sales executive in a rumpled suit, chuckled nervously, eager to align himself with the perceived strength of the speaker. The woman in 22C, the subject of this public critique, didn't even flinch. Her hands, a blur of practiced motion, continued their intricate dance with the merino wool and slender bamboo needles, the soft, rhythmic clicking a stark contrast to the abrasive tone of the man beside her in 22D. Her posture was relaxed, her focus absolute, as if the world consisted only of the emerging pattern of a simple gray scarf. She wore sensible shoes, faded jeans, and a plain blue sweater that seemed to absorb the cabin light rather than reflect it. There was nothing about her that demanded attention, a quiet study in deliberate anonymity. The man in 22D, by contrast, was a monument to self-importance. He was a Navy SEAL, a fact made clear not by a uniform, but by the constellation of subtle and not-so-subtle signifiers. The expensive tactical watch with a face the size of a silver dollar, the proprietary Trident insignia discreetly embroidered on his go bag, the way he occupied his seat not as a passenger, but as a warrior temporarily inconvenienced by civilian travel. He saw the world as a threat matrix, and the woman beside him was a glaring anomaly, a soft target in a world of hard edges. His assumptions were a fortress, built brick by brick from a life of proven physical superiority, and from within its walls, he judged the world. He saw her knitting not as a pastime, but as a symbol of weakness, a frivolous distraction from the ever-present potential for crisis. The irony, a force as powerful and invisible as the jet stream guiding the aircraft, was already beginning to gather in the recycled air of the cabin. But on the ground, 1,000 miles away in a secure command center, a retired 4-star general monitoring transponder data for a completely unrelated exercise felt a jolt of recognition as a passenger manifest for Transcon Air Flight 727 was cross-referenced against a deep archive watch list. He zoomed in on a single name, a name that hadn't been spoken in public for over a decade, a name that was more myth than memory. He saw her seat assignment, 22C, and he felt a cold dread mixed with a profound, forgotten respect. If you believe that true strength is measured in actions, not announcements, type competence in the comments below. The flight continued its serene journey through the stratosphere, a silver dart painting a white line across an endless blue canvas. Inside, the cabin was a microcosm of society, a collection of strangers bound by a temporary, fragile trust in technology and procedure. The SEAL, whose name was Lieutenant Commander Rick Reaper Thorne, had settled into a state of restless vigilance. He scanned the other passengers, categorizing them, assessing their potential as assets or liabilities. The college students in the back, loud and oblivious. The young family with a crying infant, a definite liability. The businessman in first class, soft and entitled. His gaze kept returning to the woman in 22C. Her continued, placid focus on her knitting was an affront to his entire worldview. It was, to him, a failure to acknowledge the precariousness of their situation, suspended 7 miles above the earth in a pressurized metal tube. He prided himself on his professionalism, a creed that demanded constant awareness, a perpetual state of readiness. Her calm felt like ignorance, her silence a form of negligence. He leaned slightly toward the flight attendant during her next pass. "Ma'am, is there a policy on implements like that?" he asked, nodding his head toward the knitting needles. "Just seems unsecured." He was framing his prejudice as a safety concern, a common tactic of the self-assured. The flight attendant, whose name was Sarah, was tired. It was the third leg of a 4-day trip, and her patience was as thin as the high-altitude air. "They're bamboo, sir. TSA approved." "She's fine," Thorne grunted, unconvinced. The entire interaction was predicated on a series of flawed assumptions. He assumed his military experience gave him superior insight into all forms of risk. He assumed her gender and quiet hobby were definitive indicators of her capabilities. He assumed his loud confidence was synonymous with competence. He was in every meaningful way profoundly and dangerously wrong. The woman beside him, whose name on the manifest read Dr. Eris Thorne, a coincidence of nomenclature that was yet another layer of unseen irony, felt his judgment like a change in cabin pressure. She didn't need to hear his words to understand his assessment. She had felt it her entire life. It was the low, constant hum of being underestimated, a background noise she had long ago learned to tune out, to use as a form of camouflage. Her focus on the knitting was not a distraction. It was a discipline. Each loop of yarn over the needle was a practiced, precise motion, a form of meditation that sharpened her mind, slowed her heart rate, and allowed her to exist in a state of perfect, patient readiness. Her hands, which the seal saw as tools for a quaint craft, had manipulated far more complex and dangerous instruments in environments that would have crushed him. The deafening silence of near orbit, the crushing pressure of the deep sea, the screaming chaos of a supersonic flat spin. The soft clicking of her needles was the ticking of a clock, counting down to the moment when assumptions would evaporate in the face of undeniable truth. It began not with a bang, but with a shudder, a subtle, unnatural vibration that ran through the fuselage, a tremor that was felt more in the bones than it was heard. The rhythmic drone of the engines faltered for a half-second, a skip in the heartbeat of the machine. Most passengers, lost in movies or sleep, didn't notice. But Thorne noticed. His head snapped up, his body tensing, his hand instinctively moving to the tactical bag at his feet. His training screamed that something was wrong. The woman in 22C noticed too. Her hand stopped. The clicking ceased. She lifted her head, her gaze not directed at a window or toward the cockpit, but inward, as if listening to the aircraft's soul. A small chime echoed through the cabin, the kind that usually signals the seatbelt sign being turned on or off. But this time, it was followed by a choked, static-filled sound from the intercom. A single, unintelligible syllable, then silence. A wave of nervous murmurs rippled through the passengers. The flight attendants exchanged a look of professional concern that was a thin veil for rising fear. The aircraft gave another, more violent lurch, this time to the left, and the nose dipped sickeningly. A few screams erupted from the back. The autopilot, a system of immense complexity and reliability, was clearly disengaging or failing. The plane was now a glider, a very heavy, very fast glider, and someone needed to be flying it. Thorne was already unbuckling. "I'm a Navy SEAL," he announced to the nearest flight attendant, his voice a blade of authority cutting through the rising panic. "I have flight experience. I can help." His assumption was that his experience, likely a few dozen hours in a turboprop or a helicopter, was the best option available. He was moving toward the cockpit door, ready to be the hero, the man of action his entire identity was built around. But it was in that moment of self-aggrandizing action that he was stopped, not by a command, but by a quiet, simple gesture. The woman from 22C was standing in the aisle ahead of him. She had placed her knitting neatly into her bag. She turned to the lead flight attendant, a man named David whose face was ashen. Her voice, when she spoke, was shockingly calm, devoid of any inflection or fear. It was the voice of a technician diagnosing a faulty engine. "I need you to open that door." Now David, panicked and overwhelmed, looked from her to the charging SEAL. "Ma'am, please, return to your seat." Thorne stepped forward. "Get out of the way. Let the professionals handle this." He reached to move her aside. And then she spoke to him, her eyes meeting his for the first time. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and held a depth of experience that made the air in his lungs feel thin. "You're a passenger. Your job is to remain calm and seated. Mine is about to begin." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a debate. It was a statement of irrefutable fact, delivered with a chilling lack of emotion. The sheer, unshakable certainty in her voice was more powerful than his physical presence. For the first time in his adult life, Lieutenant Commander Rick Thorne hesitated. The aircraft shuddered again, its descent steepening. The screams in the cabin became a chorus of pure terror. The lead flight attendant, David, his face a mask of sweat and fear, was paralyzed by procedure and protocol. The cockpit door was reinforced, a post 9/11 measure designed to keep people out. Opening it mid-flight for a passenger was unthinkable, a cardinal sin of aviation. Yet the alternative was a spiraling, uncontrolled dive into the earth. The woman in 22C, Eris, did not waste time arguing. She looked past the flight attendant, her gaze fixed on the keypad for the cockpit door. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of analysis and execution, was processing dozens of variables at once. The angle of descent, the yaw rate, the audible stress on the airframe, the time remaining until catastrophic structural failure. She knew the override code protocol. She also knew that in a double pilot incapacitation event, the crew might not have had time to input it. David, she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a laser. Give me your access card. I know the emergency bypass. He stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile her unassuming appearance with the absolute authority in her voice. The SEAL, Thorn, was still standing behind her, a statue of thwarted momentum. His entire being was screaming at him to take charge, to shove this woman aside and kick the door down, to impose his will on the chaos. But the quiet competence radiating from her was a force field he couldn't breach. It was a language of professionalism he didn't speak, but was beginning to recognize. With a trembling hand, David fumbled for his lanyard and handed her the card. She swiped it. An amber light blinked. She then entered a sequence of numbers and letters on the keypad with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. Her fingers didn't peck at the keys, they flowed over them. It was the muscle memory of 1,000 hours of practice. The lock disengaged with a heavy, metallic clunk. She pushed the door open and stepped inside without a moment's hesitation, the SEAL and the flight attendant staring into the dimly lit cockpit after her. The scene was worse than they imagined. Both the pilot and the co-pilot were slumped forward in their seats, unconscious, their heads resting against the yokes. The cockpit was filled with a cacophony of alarms, a stall warning, an overspeed warning, a dozen other synthesized voices screaming about imminent disaster. The plane was in a controlled dive, but rapidly approaching the speed and angle where it would become entirely uncontrolled. Eris didn't spare the pilots a second glance. Her focus was absolute, her movements economical. She slid into the co-pilot's seat, her hands gliding over the controls as if she were born there. She grabbed the yoke, her touch firm but not jarring, and began to counteract the dive. She disabled the most distracting alarms with a few deft flicks of a switch. Her right hand danced across the center console, adjusting trim, throttling back the engines, her eyes scanning the dizzying array of instruments. She wasn't just flying the plane. She was communing with it, feeling its stresses, understanding its limits. Thorn watched from the doorway, his mouth agape. The arrogance had been sandblasted off his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated awe. He had seen elite operators under pressure, men who could function in the heart of a firefight. But this was different. This wasn't about aggression or strength. This was about a sublime, almost transcendent level of skill. It was a complete mastery of a complex system in a state of critical failure. In the span of 30 seconds, the deafening alarms fell silent. The sickening dive leveled out. The groaning of the airframe ceased. The plane was stable, flying straight and level. A profound silence descended upon the cockpit, broken only by the hum of the avionics and the ragged sound of Thorn's own breathing. She keyed the radio, her voice as calm as if she were ordering a coffee. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Transcon 727. Both pilots are incapacitated. The aircraft is now under my control. The cabin behind them was still filled with the sounds of weeping and prayer, but the motion of the aircraft was once again smooth, safe, and professional. The immediate crisis was over. The demonstration was complete. The response from air traffic control was a burst of static-laced disbelief. Transcon 727. Say again? Who is this? Identify yourself. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Marcus Vance, the senior controller at the Atlanta RTCC, a veteran with 25 years of experience who thought he had seen everything. He had handled engine failures, hydraulic leaks, bomb threats, and emergency landings in hurricane-force winds. He had never, ever heard a passenger calmly declare they had taken control of a commercial airliner. In the cockpit of Flight 727, Eris didn't waste a breath on pleasantries. Her communication was as precise and economical as her actions. This is a passenger. I am type rated on the 737 to 800 series. Both pilots are unresponsive. I have stabilized the aircraft at flight level 290, requesting vectors to the nearest suitable airport with emergency services. The sheer technical proficiency in her transmission sent a jolt through the control center. She used the right terminology. She gave the correct flight level. She knew exactly what to ask for. This wasn't some panicked amateur with a flight simulator hobby. Marcus Vance's mind raced. He signaled for his supervisor, his hand gesturing frantically. On his screen, he could see the flight path of Transcon 727. It had been a terrifying red line plunging downwards. Now it was a perfectly straight green vector. The data matched her claim. She had impossibly arrested the dive. Transcon 727, Marcus said, his voice now laced with a mixture of professional focus and profound curiosity. Squawk 7700. We are clearing a path for you. Can you state your name and qualifications, ma'am? While this exchange was happening, the SEAL, Thorne, was leaning against the cockpit door frame, utterly humbled. The world he knew, a world neatly divided into predators and prey, assets and liabilities, had been turned upside down. The woman he had dismissed as a frivolous hobbyist was now the single most competent person he had ever witnessed. Her calm was not ignorance, it was mastery. Her silence was not weakness. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. He felt a profound sense of shame, hot and sharp, for his earlier arrogance. His assumptions hadn't just been wrong. They had been a desecration of a professionalism so complete it was almost holy. He watched her hands as they moved, her left hand resting gently on the yoke, making minute, almost invisible corrections, while her right continued to interface with the flight management system, reprogramming their course. They were the same hands that had been knitting a simple gray scarf just minutes before. The revelation was staggering. Back in Atlanta, the supervisor had patched in the FAA, NORAD, and the Department of Homeland Security. A national-level incident was unfolding in real time. The passenger manifest for Flight 727 was now on every screen. A senior FAA official, a woman named Helen Reed, was scanning the list. Give me everything you have on a passenger named Eris Thorne. Seat 22C. The name meant nothing to the junior analysts, but to a few old hands in aviation and military circles, it was like hearing a ghost story. A file, sealed for over a decade under a national security directive, was being pulled from a deep digital archive. It was heavily redacted, but what was visible was enough to make Helen Reed's blood run cold. She keyed her microphone, her voice now filled with a reverence that bordered on awe, cutting across all other channels. Atlanta Center, she said, her voice tight with emotion. You are speaking to Colonel Eris Thorne, United States Air Force, retired. Confirm identity with call sign Ghost. In the cockpit, Eris heard the transmission. A flicker of something, annoyance, memory, crossed her face for a barest fraction of a second. She keyed her mic, her voice unchanged. Call sign is retired, FAA. But Ghost copies, the validation was complete. The mystery was solved. The quiet professional had a name, and that name was Legend. The name Ghost echoed through the secure channels like a thunderclap. For the younger generation of controllers and agents, it meant nothing. But for the veterans, the graybeards in the back rooms of the Pentagon and the FAA, it was the resurrection of a myth. Colonel Eris Ghost Thorne was not just a pilot. She was a creature of aviation folklore, a test pilot from a forgotten era of black projects and experimental aircraft. She was the one they sent when the physics didn't add up, when the computer models failed, when a machine was deemed unflyable. She had flown prototypes that officially never existed, pushed airframes to breaking points that engineers swore were impossible, and survived incidents that should have left nothing but a crater in the desert floor. Her service record, now unsealed and flashing on screens across the country, read like a work of fiction. Over 10,000 flight hours in more than 70 different aircraft, from supersonic bombers to hypersonic reconnaissance platforms. Multiple distinguished flying crosses. The Collier Trophy for Aeronautical Achievement. A combat record in Desert Storm that was almost entirely blacked out. Her last official assignment had been as the chief of the Air Force's most secretive test pilot school, a place so classified it was known only by a number. Then, a decade ago, she had simply vanished. A quiet retirement, a name deliberately scrubbed from the public record for her own safety and privacy. She had traded the cockpit of a spy plane for a quiet life, a rocking chair, and a pair of knitting needles. The legend had chosen anonymity. Now, through a cruel twist of fate, that anonymity was shattered. In the control tower, Marcus Vance stared at a screen at the calm green line of Flight 727 and felt a profound sense of privilege. He was no longer just guiding a plane in distress. He was a witness to history, a supporting actor in the final act of a master's career. His entire demeanor shifted. The professional respect he showed to all pilots was elevated to a level of reverence he had never before displayed. "Ghost, this is Atlanta's center," he said, his voice now soft, deferential. "The sky is yours. We are diverting all traffic in a 200-mile radius. You have your choice of any runway in the southeastern United States. Just tell us what you need." He was not speaking to a passenger. He was speaking to a commander, to royalty. Inside the cockpit, Thorne was processing the information he was hearing over the radio. "Colonel, test pilot, Ghost." The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the stories, the whispers in the barracks and ready rooms about the legendary pilot who could fly anything, the one who wrote the book on high-altitude stalls and dead-stick landings. He had always assumed Ghost was a man. His every assumption had been wrong, a cascade of ignorant, gendered prejudice. He looked at the woman in the pilot's seat, who was now calmly discussing the gross weight of the aircraft and the ideal runway length for a powerless landing with the engineer from Boeing who had been patched into the call. She was the source of a legend. He had sat next to a living myth for 2 hours and had seen nothing but a harmless old woman. The shame he felt was no longer just personal, it was institutional. He represented a culture that often valued swagger over substance, volume over value. He was the loud, superficial arrogance the core theme of his own life had warned him against. His gaze fell to her bag, where the gray scarf lay half-finished, a testament to the quiet, methodical precision that defined her. It was the same precision she was now using to save the lives of everyone on board, including his own. He finally understood. The knitting wasn't a distraction from her readiness. It was the very source of it. It was her discipline, her focus, her calm, all woven into a simple piece of fabric. The story of what was happening aboard Flight 727 began to leak, then pour, into the world. It started with a single, garbled tweet from a passenger in the back of the plane. "Pilots passed out on my flight to Norfolk. Some lady is flying the plane." Praying, the message, initially dismissed as a hoax, was quickly corroborated by live air traffic control feeds that amateur aviation enthusiasts monitored obsessively. The call sign Transcon 727 and the emergency squawk code 7700 lit up forums and chat rooms. Then, her name and her call sign, Ghost, were leaked, likely by a stunned lower-level government employee. Within minutes, the legend of Colonel Eris Thorne was resurrected for the digital age. News helicopters were scrambled. Reporters descended on the airports she was being vectored towards. The flight became the #1 trending topic worldwide. On board the aircraft, however, there was only a bubble of intense, focused calm. Colonel Thorne had decided on a dead-stick landing. The engines were functioning, but the pilots were still incapacitated, and she didn't know the cause. It could have been a toxic fume leak, an issue with the oxygen supply, something that could compromise the engines or electronics at any moment. She preferred to rely on the one thing she trusted implicitly, gravity and her own skill. She requested a long, clear runway at Dobbins Air Reserve Base, a military field outside Atlanta. She knew it well. She had tested experimental landers there decades ago. As she began her long, slow, unpowered descent from 30,000 feet, she turned to the SEAL for the first time since entering the cockpit. "Lieutenant Commander," she said, her tone still flat and professional, but no longer as cold. I need you to go back into the cabin. I need you to brief the passengers. Tell them what's going to happen. Use your command voice. Keep them calm. Can you do that? For Rick Thorne, it was a moment of redemption. She wasn't dismissing him. She was giving him a job, a mission. She was acknowledging his skills, not his rank or his ego, but his actual ability to command respect and project calm. She was treating him like a professional. Yes, ma'am, he said, the words coming out with a humility he had never known. He turned and went back into the cabin. He stood at the front, his posture no longer arrogant, but strong and reassuring. He told the passengers the truth, that the pilots were incapacitated, but the aircraft was under the control of an incredibly experienced Air Force pilot. He explained what a deadstick landing was, that the engines would be off, that it would be quiet, and that the landing might be firm, but that they were in the most capable hands on the planet. His voice, stripped of its earlier arrogance, was filled with a genuine, hard-won respect that was more powerful than any order. The passengers, terrified but desperate for a reason to hope, listened. They believed him because he so clearly believed in her. The legend was spreading not just through the internet, but from person to person in the quiet, terrified cabin of a gliding Boeing 737. Back in the cockpit, Eris was flying not with instruments, but with her senses. She was feeling the energy of the aircraft, judging the glide slope by sight, listening to the whisper of the wind over the wings. It was pure, instinctual flying, an art form that was being lost in the age of automation. She was a relic, a master artisan in a world of mass production, and this was her final, unexpected masterpiece. The landing was a study in perfection. The Boeing 737, now a 70-ton glider, descended from the sky with an eerie, unnatural silence. On the ground at Dobbins Air Reserve Base, a sea of emergency vehicles, news vans, and military personnel watched in stunned disbelief. They were accustomed to the roar of jet engines, but Flight 727 approached like a ghost, a silent silver shape against the afternoon sun. Inside the cockpit, Colonel Thorne was a portrait of focused tranquility. Her hands rested lightly on the yoke. Her feet danced on the rudder pedals, making infinitesimal adjustments, bleeding off speed, managing energy with the precision of surgeon. She was not fighting the plane. She was guiding it, persuading it toward the runway. She flared the aircraft just feet above the asphalt, a maneuver of sublime timing, holding in the air for a few seconds longer, until it was just above stall speed. The rear landing gear touched the tarmac with a gentle chirp, so soft it was almost imperceptible. The nose came down smoothly, and she deployed the thrust reversers on the now idling engines and applied the brakes with practiced, even pressure. The massive airliner rolled down the runway and came to a perfect stop precisely on the center line, as if it were just another routine arrival. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then a roar erupted from the emergency crews on the ground, a spontaneous, cathartic cheer of relief and awe. The legend of Ghost was no longer a story from the past. It was a living, breathing reality they had all just witnessed. Inside the cabin, the passengers, who had been bracing for a violent impact, sat in stunned silence. The landing had been smoother than most normal powered landings. Then the silence broke, and the cabin filled with the sound of weeping. But this time it was tears of joy and relief. They were alive. They were safe. A flight attendant keyed the intercom, her voice choked with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, we are on the ground. Amid the celebration, Rick Thorne, the Navy SEAL, made his way back to the cockpit. The door was open. Medics were now attending to the unconscious pilots. Colonel Thorne was sitting in her seat, running through the post-landing checklist, her work not yet finished. He stood in the doorway, waiting. When she was done, she powered down the last of the systems, and the cockpit fell truly silent. She finally looked up at him. He didn't say thank you. The words felt too small, too inadequate. Instead, he simply stood straight, brought his heels together, and rendered the sharpest, most formal salute of his entire career. It was a gesture of profound, unconditional respect, an acknowledgement of a superior officer, a superior aviator, and a superior professional. It was his apology, his gratitude, and his oath to never forget the lesson he had learned that day. Colonel Thorne looked at him, and for the first time, a small, weary smile touched her lips. She gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acceptance, a dismissal, a final lesson in quiet competence. The story of the knitter of Flight 727 became an instant global phenomenon. The footage of the silent landing, captured by a dozen news helicopters, was played on a loop on every network. The audio recordings from the cockpit and the control tower were analyzed by experts who spoke in reverent tones about her skill, her calm, her absolute professionalism. Thorne's salute, captured by a news camera with a long lens through the cockpit window, became the defining image of the event, a powerful symbol of arrogance humbled by competence. The SEAL, once the antagonist of the story, became one of its most important proponents. In the debriefings and interviews that followed, he was unflinchingly honest. He recounted his initial, arrogant dismissal of Colonel Thorne. He spoke of his own prejudice, his own flawed assumptions. He didn't make excuses. He owned his mistake, and in doing so, he amplified the story's true meaning. He told every reporter, every investigator, every panel, "I thought I was the most capable person on that plane. I was wrong. The best of us was sitting right next to me, and I didn't even see her." His public humbling became a powerful lesson for a generation of military and civilian professionals, a viral case study in the dangers of confusing confidence with competence. The gray, half-finished scarf and the bamboo knitting needles were requested by the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. They were placed in a glass case next to the command module of Apollo 11, a humble, handmade artifact sitting beside a marvel of technology. The exhibit's plaque did not recount her heroic actions. It simply read, discipline, focus, readiness. These were the tools of her trade, no different from a pilot's checklist or a soldier's rifle. The flight number, Transcon 727, was respectfully retired by the airline. Among pilots and air traffic controllers, any long, perfect, unpowered approach became known as flying a Thorne pattern. The legend had been updated, cemented into the very language of the institution she had once served in secret. Years passed. The world, with its short memory, moved on to other headlines, other heroes, other crises. But in the quiet corners of the aviation and military communities, the story of Flight 727 did not fade. It became something more than a news item. It became folklore, a modern parable passed down from instructors to students, from veterans to rookies. It was used as a teaching tool at the Air Force Academy, at Naval Air Station Pensacola, and in the training centers for every major airline. The lesson was always the same. Look beyond the surface. Respect the quiet professional. Understand that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice least. Competence doesn't need to advertise. It simply performs. The story taught pilots that true skill is not just about managing the machine, but about managing yourself. It taught special operators that situational awareness means being aware of your own biases. It taught leaders that true strength is often found in humility, not hubris. Lieutenant Commander Rick Thorne, now Captain Thorne, became one of the most respected and effective leaders in naval special warfare. The experience on that flight had fundamentally changed him. He was still demanding, still a hard-edged warrior, but his arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep-seated humility. He made it his personal mission to root out the kind of prejudice he himself had once displayed. He would often end his briefings to young SEALs with the story of the woman who knit a scarf while saving 154 lives. Your biggest threat, he would tell them, is not the enemy you can see. It's the assumptions you can't. Never, ever underestimate anyone. He never saw Colonel Thorne again. After the initial media storm, she had once again retreated into the quiet anonymity she cherished. She gave no interviews, wrote no books, accepted no awards. Her work was done, and she required no validation. Her legacy was not in the headlines or the museum exhibits. It was in the changed behavior of the people she had saved, in the lessons that were now woven into the fabric of the institution she had served. Her legacy was in the quiet competence she had both demonstrated and inspired. The quiet professional had returned to her silence. Her point proven not with words, but with a single, flawless action. The world was safer, not just because she had been on that plane, but because her story made everyone who heard it a little wiser, a little more humble, a little more observant. The triumph was not just hers. It was a victory for a way of being, a philosophy of action over talk. The true measure of a legacy is not a plaque on a wall or a name in a history book. It is not found in the thunder of public applause, but in the quiet, continuing echo of an example set. The legacy of Colonel Eris Thorne was not the single, dramatic event of Flight 727. It was the thousands of subsequent moments where a young pilot paused to double-check their assumptions, where a seasoned officer chose to listen to a junior subordinate, where a leader understood that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most important. Her actions that day created a ripple that expanded far beyond the lives of the passengers she saved. It was a ripple of humility, a wave of respect for the silent, unseen competence that holds the world together. It is the competence of the unassuming engineer who designs a flawless bridge, the quiet nurse who spots a fatal symptom, the patient teacher who unlocks a child's potential. They are the ghosts of our society, the masters of their craft who seek no credit, who find their reward in the work itself. Their silence is not emptiness. It is the calm at the center of the storm, a space where true professionalism can flourish, free from the corrupting influence of ego. The story of a knitter who flew a plane became a touchstone, a modern myth that reminded us of a timeless truth, that assumptions are the enemies of wisdom, that prejudice is the foe of progress, and that true strength is a quiet, steady force that reveals itself not in boasts, but in moments of crisis. It reminded us that respect is not a courtesy to be given, but a conclusion to be reached after careful observation. It is earned through demonstrated excellence, through the calm, methodical application of skill under pressure. It is earned in the silence between the action and the applause. The world will always have its share of loud, arrogant gatekeepers who judge by the shallowest of metrics. But it will also have its quiet professionals, its masters, who move among us unnoticed, their extraordinary skills hidden behind a veil of ordinary life. They're the ones who are truly ready. They're the ones who, when the moment comes, will simply put down their knitting and get to work. Their legacy is not what they leave behind, but what continues forward, a quiet current of competence that guides us all toward a safer shore. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.